Hello everyone and welcome back. Let's continue our discussion on the collections module counter method. Let's start by creating a counter object and then save it in a variable called x. So x is equal to collections.counter, and then let's pass a string of numbers. Let's say 1 2 3 4 5 2 2. Then if we call x, we have a counter of each of the elements. We can use a for loop to access our counter object and find out the element and the number of counts for it. We can say, let's say for numbers in our counter x, we can say print. What do we want to print? Let's use some string formatting. So we want to count each of our numbers and then the number of times it appears. So we can do that. That format. Then we can pass numbers, and then we can say, then for the number of counts we can simply say our object x, then numbers. So if we run this, we get, so 1 appears once, 3 appears once, 2 appears 3 times, 5 and 4 appear once. That's how we can use for loops. We can also say, let's for instance, we can say for numbers in, let's say 1 2 3 4 6, we can say print. Let's do some formatting. That format, and they will pass numbers, and then x will index our object x for each of our numbers. So this will give us the number of counts of each of our numbers. So notice here we have 1 2 3 4 5 4 and 6. So 6 doesn't appear in our counter object, right? What this will do is for numbers in 1 2 3 4 6, print. So it will check. So for numbers in this means it will take the first number, which is 1, and then print. So it will print 1, and the number of times 1 appears in our counter x. So it will print 1, and then it will take 2, and then find out the number of times 2 appears in our counter object x, and so on. But when it reaches 6, 6 doesn't appear anywhere in our counter object x. So what do you think we'll get when we run this for loop? Okay, so we're not going to get an error. So in this case, what will happen is the number of counts for our number 6 will be 0. So even if the element doesn't appear in our counter object, we're not going to get an error. We'll simply get a count of 0 for that specific element. Let me run it and show you. So we already know the first 4, and then 6 is equal to 0. Great. Our counter object also has another method called elements. So we can use this elements to get a list of our counter object. So how can we use this elements method? We can say we have our object x. If we call x, it's a counter object with this elements and number of counts. So what we can do is we can call the elements method on our counter X object, x.elements. Okay, we see that it's an itertool object and its location in memory. So what we can do is we can convert this x.elements object. Since it's iterable, we can convert it into a list. So we can say list x.elements. Okay, so we are casting it to a list, and that will produce a list of all the elements, right? There is another method called most common, and we can use this most common method to find out the most frequently occurring elements in our counter object. So to use this most common method, let's create another counter object, and we'll save it in a variable called, let's say, xyz. Then we'll set this to be equal to collections that counter, and let's add a bunch of strings containing the elements x, y, z, x, x, y, y, z, x, abc, krv, yz. Okay, we can say for letters, and let's say number. So this number will be number of count for letters, and number of counts in our counter object xyz that most common. We can say, so here we can pass the number of elements we want to find out. For instance, let's say 2. So this will calculate the 2 most frequently occurring elements in our counter object. So for letters, number in xyz dot most common, we can print out, let's use some string formatting, that format, then pass letters and number of times those letters are appearing. So if we run it, we have y and x are the 2 most frequently occurring elements in our counter object. Similarly, if I copy this, paste it here, and if I want to find out the 4 most common elements, here they are. Y appears 4 times, x appears 4 times, z appears 3 times, and a appears once. So this is how we can use the most common method. We can pass the number of times certain elements are appearing the most. We can also perform some operations on 2 counter objects. Let's see some examples. Let's create 2 counter objects and save them in variables called first and second. Let's say first is equal to collections.counter, and let's pass a list containing elements x, y, z, x, let's say y, y, and z. So that's for our first counter object, and for our second counter object we can say collections.counter, and let's pass bunch of characters. X, Y, Z, A, B, C, R, X. Let's see how many elements we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, let's remove the last X. Okay, now that we have our two counter objects, let's see what they look like. First, then second. Okay, looks good. So we can say first plus second, and that will combine all the elements inside each of our counter objects. So here we have A, B, C, R, X, Y, Z, right? And then the ones that are common are added up. In our first counter object, X appears twice. In our second counter object, X appears once. And in first plus second, X appears 3 times, right? 2 plus 1, 3. Similarly, Y appears 3 times in our first counter object. In our second counter object, Y appears once. 3 plus 1 is 4. And for Z, 2 plus 1 is 3. And we have the rest of our elements. Similarly, we can say first minus second. So this will do the opposite of addition, right? So X appears twice in our first object, and it appears once. So 2 minus 1, now we have 1. For Y, we have 3 minus 1, 2. And for Z, it will be 2 minus 1, which is 1. So that's subtraction. We can also check out the union and intersection of those two counter objects. First, let's see the union. So we can say first or second. Run it. So this is the union. And the union takes the maximum value. Okay. So let me call our first object. Then we have our second. So here, in our first counter object, X appears twice. In our second counter object, X appears once. When we use the union method, or, it takes the maximum occurrence of an element. So X appears twice in our first object. That's why we see X2, not X1. Similarly, for Y, we see a count of 3, not 1. And same thing for Z. That's because union takes the maximum of the occurrence. Whereas the other method is intersection. So if we say first, intersection is end, second. So unlike union, intersection takes the minimum number of occurrence. So here we have X appearing once, Y and Z appearing once. That's because we took those objects from our second counter object, X, Y, Z, that have the lower occurrence. Okay, that's the difference between the intersection and union methods. Great. This is what I have for the counters method. In the next lecture, we'll look at more methods in the collections module. Thank you, everyone.